Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Twilight Show on Teachers Talk Radio. I hope you are all doing really well this evening. I'm very lucky today to have a very experienced guest with me, and a man who is going to be very much the expert to myself as the layman this evening. And we're going to have a little bit of a chat. And hopefully we're going to cover a few topics, but of course we may go off on a few tangents as teachers have a tendency to do. But basically we all love talking shop, and that's why we're here. And hopefully some of you guys are going to be able to join us within the hour. And I'm really hoping that we can learn a few bits and some things will come out. So I've got with me today consultant John Bald. Good afternoon, John. How are you doing?
Good afternoon, Tony. A bit better than I deserve, I think. Thank you.
No, I'm sure that's not true. Now, John has spent a career in education at various roles and various levels. And I'm really, really happy that John has agreed to come on. We're going to get into some of the things that I think it's fair to say John feels particularly strongly about or has some views. And with your background, in fact, before I go into that, I'm sure the people watching and listening would be interested, John, to know a little bit about your background and career, if you wouldn't mind just filling us in.
Certainly, Tony. Well, I started teaching in North London in 1973. I was going to do a PhD, and I suddenly decided that the subject matter, which we'll leave out, I don't think it was worth spending a lifetime on. And initially, I wasn't a very good teacher at all. I tried hard, but I didn't really know what I was doing. And anyway, one day, somebody basically bunked off my lesson. And I went round to see him because I had a good relationship with him. The relationships weren't the main problem at all. But, I said, well, are we going to see you tomorrow? Yes, sir. Well, thanks for coming around. Right, fine. So I went back into school, met the deputy head, who told me, you can't read, don't you? I said, what? He's been in school for 6 years and he can't read? He said, lots of boys in the first year can't read. I thought, what? I just became a reading teacher. I just decided I had to become a reading teacher, and that's what I spent my life doing primarily. I found that fortunately, I was better at that than I was at doing some of the other things. I went to work in a reading unit in South London, and I then became a head of department in the East End, wrote a couple of articles. I noticed some patterns in spelling, which I wrote up and published in The Guardian. And I moved from there to Essex Education Department as tutor in charge of a reading and language development centre, where I spent 13 years. And that let me work in all types of school in one of the largest authorities in the country and to learn from the practitioners. I really did enjoy working with the teachers because I could, first of all, I learned from them. Second, because I had time to do the extra reading and to fit in, to be acquainted with everything that was available. Because I thought if you're giving somebody advice on something, it's really your job to be as well informed as you possibly can be. And I had free rein to do that. Eventually, there was a reorganization and in Essex, and I went freelance in 93. I became an Ofsted inspector, partly because I liked HMI. I admired HMI. I'd met a couple of them, I'd learned from them, and I liked the way they did things. I didn't like what happened to Ofsted in 2005 when they stopped inspecting schools as thoroughly. I don't think they're doing their work properly, and I became freelancer. Fortunately, Sir Michael Tomlinson, who was formerly a chief inspector, he asked me to come and do consultancy work in Hackney, and I've done that ever since. eventually working closely with parents. I've had the luxury of working with individual children a great deal. And I think that is a test bed, because you can really think, what is causing this problem? How do I help the person adjust their thinking so that they're not going to have the problem so much anymore? And parents asked me to move into maths, so I've done that as well. And my first degree was in French. And strangely enough, that's proved so useful, because the real difficulty with learning to read in English rather than a language like Spanish or Finnish is that we were invaded by William the Conqueror in 1066, and the language was flooded with French for 300 years. And it just struck me that, this requires an adjustment in thinking, because what we've usually done is put English pronunciation on top of French spelling. Table, So I found that once I explained this and started telling children, well, look, do you behave perfectly all the time, or most of the time? Or most of the time. All right, we'll settle for that. Well, languages are human as well. They behave as we expect most of the time, but not all the time. So what we've got to do is to be able to use what they do most of the time when they're behaving themselves, and then to see where what I might call the naughty bits are, the difficult bits. And once I explain that, they actually stop looking for it to be totally regular and sounding words out one letter at a time, which doesn't work with longer words. And they can make progress. And that's basically what I do. And I love doing it, because the children actually love learning. That's basically what I've done, and what I continue to do. I've done CPD for various people. I wrote reading research for the Times Educational Supplement for about 13 years in the middle of the reading wars. And I do enjoy it. I do it because I like it.
I mean, yeah, obviously you could have chosen to retire, I suppose, if you had that option. But you mentioned, what's interesting there is you mentioned about phonics. Yeah. Now, as I said in the introduction, being the layman, but I do remember my own children doing phonics. And obviously I did a little bit of homework. For me, was just looking at phonics and the alternative, which is the whole language approach to teaching reading. So really, and also I put a few questions and things that I wanted to sort of ask you about specifically. So, I mean, I just wondered what your concerns were. Obviously, you mentioned about sort of phonics already. So, is your concern around phonics as an approach, or is it more to do with how it's used in schools, how it's interpreted in schools?
I think the second. In the ancient world, ancient writing moved from more or less pictures or little marks to the alphabet, and the Greeks were the first that really had a fully alphabetic system, and the alphabet was based on recording sounds through letters. And that is the characteristic of every alphabetic system. So it is basic. You've got to be able to use that. And I use I make sure that people can understand the 3-letter combinations, where they're nice and regular, because sometimes when they're not words themselves, they come up later on. A word like con. All right, it's a slang word, but con, congregation, consistency, connect. These parts of words come in later. So there's a second wind to phonics. Phonics is very important, but it's equally important that we tell children things as they are. And one of the principles I found very early in my teaching was that I must be careful how I say things, so I'm not going to have to say something that I later contradict. And I am a clumsy person. I can't help it. And some poor man had to teach me to drive. And he said something to me that was really very interesting. He said, we believe everything the mirror tells us, but we don't believe the mirror tells us everything. And that is very similar. It's not an identical match for the way that the written language mirrors the spoken language. It doesn't tell us everything, but what it does tell us is extremely important. And we've got to understand and use what it tells us And we use this, as we use it, as we understand it, our brain is building neural networks, which are reinforced every time we see the same word. As a scientist yourself, you will know about the way that electricity operates in the brain and the way that specialist brain cells deposit myelin along new connections that speeds everything up. Professor Stein, the fish cook's brother, he estimates the voltage in electricity at about 1/10 of a volt. He gave that at a talk at the Wellington Festival a few years ago that I attended. Very interesting talk he gave too. All the time we're teaching, we're activating these neural networks. And it's very important that we present things to children so that nothing interferes with that. You know, copying out is the worst thing one can do because you're jerking backwards and forwards and the brain doesn't have time to establish connections. You just create little units of what you can remember. So we're dealing, first of all, with a language that's grown up over 1,000 years. And as I say to the children, if we were 1,000 years old, we'd have a few wrinkles. So I explain what the wrinkles are. It usually gets a smile from mum as well, actually, because a parent sits in on everything I do. Very, very keen on that because they know the child and I don't. So I've got to get, and we work as a team. And I think that's very, very important.
Absolutely.
And once we can operate like that, we can understand what reinforcements a child needs, what they're good at, where they need to adjust their thinking, and all sorts of little things. I mean, a recent pupil, a pupil I've just been writing about, is a marine biologist. He wants to be a marine biologist, but he couldn't read at all. At all. He tried to sound out the word "this" one letter at a time. So I explained to him that there was this man called William the Conqueror, and he was rather a nasty man. He's not somebody you want to meet on a dark night. He was a murderer. At one point, he sent his army to the north of England to kill everybody they could find. Everybody. One of the earliest recorded war crimes in this country. And you did things his way if you wanted to live a long time. And he spoke French. He couldn't read and write himself, but he had priests and people that could do that for him. And you know, these priests didn't like things like an Anglo-Saxon, which they used to represent a TH sound. It's called thorn. It's a bit like a P with a loop halfway up the stroke. So they had to have something in the Latin alphabet that would produce that, and they used TH. Now, you can say, well, that you present that, but if you don't explain it, it's too much of a leap for the child to see what the T usually tells us, to see why it's different with an H after it.
Yeah. So what you're saying? So sorry, John. What you're saying there is they need that repetition in order to make those connections in the brain. So it's not, you can't always decode. You can't decode a word like this. You need to see words that make that sound and have that reinforcement of seeing that word again and again, and that will only come if you are reading more widely.
Well, it'll come when you see other words with this. So in this case, I have this. Well, what goes with this, this, and that? So I gave him that next, which is, you know, apart from the TH, is finally irregular, and then, and then the. And we come back to it. But the key to it is he's got to understand why he makes that big jump. It might seem a little thing to somebody that already knows it, but it's quite a big jump to go from T giving you a T sound, as in cat, to a F. And that needs to be explained for some children taking their stride.
Yeah.
Ruth Miskin, Dame Ruth Miskin said to me once, and I quite agree with her, that about half of the children will learn to read whichever way you approach it.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads, no distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. eduflix.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
Yeah. Because they're applying their mind to it, and one way and another they'll figure it out, and some children do this spontaneously. But for others, you have to explain things and to do it in language they can understand. I don't like official guidance for children of 4 to 7 using Greek words like phoneme and grapheme, when a phoneme is just a sound and a grapheme is just a group of letters. I mean, my explanation of TH, with especially with that letter, which writing things on your sleeve is often a good idea, actually, that shows how it came to be, and then unlocks thousands of words. Just doing what the government list does with lists of irregular words is not helpful, because it doesn't get at the principle. And once they understand the principle, then they can apply it, then they learn, and everybody's happy.
So they're getting a little bit sidetracked by that as it currently stands. I mean,
I think that the way that the language is presented to children is working for most of them most of the time. But for those it doesn't work for, it is causing confusion. And the solution is to explain things as they really are in simple terms that children can understand. And once it's clear, we practice.
Fab. Brilliant. Thank you for that.
I think brilliant. I get called other things sometimes.
Yeah, me too, to be honest, on a daily basis. I'm just putting up on the screen there, guys, just before we go on, John, and dig into some more bits and bobs there on phonics and reading, literacy. Just that this show is sponsored by John Catt Books. So if you look on the screen there, or if you're listening back, you need to use the code JCTTR2425, and you can go to the John Catt website, and you can get 20% off your order if you use that code, guys. So get yourself to the John Catt bookshop and have a look on there. So what we're saying, so you obviously have done an awful lot of one-to-one work with students. It's, just occurred to me, every time I've tried to do that, I find it very, very intense. And it's something I've just never been. I've tried to do a little bit of one-to-one tuition, especially with parents there, and it is a very intense experience, isn't it? It really is. And there's been times I've done it and it seems to have gone fine, and other times it's it's been difficult, and you can sometimes make a lot of progress in a short amount of time as well. I was just wondering, so one of the things I was going to ask you, it's probably not something you can condense down a lot, but what's your approach if someone comes to you, John, and saying that my son or daughter is very, very behind with their reading age, or with their reading, or they're struggling with their reading, or they can't really read at all? What is your process? Would you mind saying a bit about the process that you?
Absolutely. No, this is I really want to say I enjoy doing it. First of all, I ask parent what the child's name is, and how old they are, and what the parent seems to think, and I don't know what we can call him. Not going to call him Tony or John. Let's call him Peter. Would Peter like some help? If Peter doesn't want to have anything to do with me and refuses, I might say, well, could you see if Peter will have a word with me for a minute, and I'll see if he would give me 5 minutes of his time or something like that. But if they really, I don't want to do this, there's not much I can do. But usually, because the parent is encouraging them to come, and because my manner with children, I've been told my manner with children is quite good. I'm interested in them, I like them, and partly because I didn't find every element of learning straightforward for myself at school. Particularly, I had dreadful headaches with geometry. It took me ages to work out why, and I did eventually. But so I understand how people feel when they're feeling at school, when things are not going well. It can make a whole family unhappy, and that's another good reason for doing what I do. So I might just say, right, okay. Do you find reading easy, difficult, or what about it? I'll try and get them in some kind of conversation. Just to give me a starting point, if they've got a book they've got from school, I'll start reading that. If they haven't, then I'll ask them what they're interested in and what sort of things they like to do, and I might start something from that. I've got to make some kind of connection with what's going on in their mind and their interests. And I then have got behind this, I'm going to want them to read something to me. And what I'm trying to do is to get an idea of what it is in their thinking that's preventing them from reading or doing whatever they're trying to do as well as they would like. And then I've got to think, how do I help this child to adjust their thinking so that they can do it? And then it becomes a bit like a music lesson. I will perhaps take a sentence from any book. I've got books obviously around that I've used, but a book that's likely to interest them. Somebody, for example, one of the pupils I'm currently working with, I've only seen him once, he's interested in Harry Potter. So I've got a copy of the Harry Potter book that he's reading. We'll work on that. And then I'll get him to read something, and I'm thinking, what's causing the mistake here? And to take that particular case, the child was reading accurately but slowly and having to work each word out. Now, this is a stage in learning to read, and but because it's accurate, you see, I don't have to go over phonics stuff that he already knows or even variations. But I'm going to say to him, well, that's very good, and I enjoyed that. But I think if you listen to me read it, you'll see that I'm not working. I know these words. I'm not having to work them all out. And I try only to stop when I come to a full stop or a comma. So we'll do that, and then he will read it. And to see if he can begin to phrase it. Because we don't read words. We do scan words very closely as we read, but we don't have to work them all out because we already know them. I mean, if I come to a word I don't know, and we were talking about some of those that came up in a book I'm using with the pupil, and the word photophore, I didn't know what it was. I had to look it up. It's in fact, in case anyone else has had to look that up, it's a kind of gland, a cell on a fish that emits some light. So these fish that live in the deep sea have these photophoric cells. It's very interesting. So I had to look that up. So that's good. You see, if I'm learning at the same time as the pupil, it's a joint effort. I'm not some sort of Superman, because I know perfectly well I'm not a Superman, because I've had learning difficulties myself, and I know what it is to struggle. So I'm trying to make that adjustment, and then what I don't want is them memorizing the text. So what I'll be doing is whenever we come to a word that causes a problem, I don't teach that word. I teach another one that's like it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So somebody can't read the word sun, for example. I might get some plastic letters and make fun and explain the phonics of fun. And then I might take the F away and put a G in there. That's fun. That's gun. And then run. And then throw in, once you get a look that says, what are you doing this for? It's too easy. I'll throw in the word they got wrong. They usually get it right. So if we want a technique, I actually found in my first lesson at a school called Beaufoy in Lambeth. I worked in a reading unit there with a wonderful teacher called Mike Burton, who was the head of department, a giant of a man and a great inspiration to everybody that knew him. I owe him a lot. I said, when I joined his unit, I said, I've had enough unproductive stress. He said, all right, you're hired. There's 6 children. And somebody misread a word like round. So, and back in the days, we had things called pound notes. Very few people have heard of pound notes anymore. We think of larger, not pound notes, but I took a pound note out of my pocket. I was lucky I had such a thing. And I said, and obviously there's a visual aid with a pound note. So if that's pound, that ound, what would you do if you found a pound? And of course, the correct answer is, I took her to the police station. And then sound, changing the first letter so that this group of letters giving the ound sound, you get this idea. They don't have to work that out from scratch anymore. And once they've got, and oh, by the way, what's that? That's round. Do you see what I mean? You're actually building up their understanding. People talk about blending sounds. It's a very important thing to be able to do, but it's something you can't take for granted. You've got to be able to build up. And then eventually, in fact, you're building up syllables. You know, like configuration. You're not going to read that word one letter at a time. You've got to see figure in the middle, configure, and you build it up. So you're building up their understanding of the way language works in a way which is much more like a tree than a grid.
Yeah. So what you're saying is sorry, John. So what you're saying is that the starting point, phonics is a good starting point for learning to read at that early stage.
It's essential.
But it does get to a point where, if you're going to read for pleasure, it will get to a stage where, having to read everything phonetically sounds like very hard work for a start.
That's not possible.
And exactly. So it's not going to promote a love of reading. And like you say, in reading something that is of interest as well must be very powerful. I do find at the moment it's a worry for me because students, I'm a secondary teacher, which is why it's obviously interesting to sort of think about the roots of where students are coming from in terms of reading. I don't know whether reading age is something you might want to talk about a bit later on or in a little while.
Yes, I can talk about reading age.
Well,
shall I do that now?
We can do. What I was thinking of is whether that's something that is a sort of a big concern nationally, just because from my own experience, I'm finding students don't seem to read for pleasure. It's very, very difficult. I just want to give a couple of examples of that because obviously,
yes, please.
We know at secondary school that literacy is important. There will always be someone who's a literacy, has that role in the school, a whole school role, which will be developed literacy and so on. But their difficulty is always, how do we get students to read? Because they don't, I don't want to say they don't want to, but for some of them, they see it as a real chore. And I think they're misreading or they're rushing or they're skimming the reading. They're obviously missing key information when it comes to exam technique. It's a really big problem. I was just wondering, first of all, do you agree with me that at secondary, I know secondary, you may not deal with as many secondary students, but
I do.
Good, because I wanted to ask you, do you feel like that at secondary level, reading is becoming more of a problem? And if so, what do you think is possible that we could do about it going forward?
What we need to do is, first of all, to start where the children are, take nothing for granted. Not try and build a house by putting on the roof or even starting halfway up the wall. And by using reading as a medium for teaching in all subjects. I've seen this done very successfully in primary and secondary schools. You've used, make them use reading as a vehicle so that we'll start by reading this and then acting on it. Not everybody likes to read long novels. As a student, and I was a literature student, literature and history, I was astonished at the capacity of some of my colleagues to read a book like Middlemarch in 2 or 3 days. That's a heck of a big novel. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's a brilliant book. And I think that I think that the getting the right mix of reading for children, for example, I will show you this. That is the book that my pupil, who wants to be a marine biologist, his father bought it for him. It's got attractive illustrations right the way through. It's got really interesting text. And he wants to read that. So first of all, and it's a non-fiction book. We have had too much emphasis on fiction and not non-fiction in primary schools since the Plowden Report in 1965. We've thought of literature as stories. Now, I'm happy, obviously, for stories and poetry to be a major part of the school curriculum, but that doesn't mean we don't use non-fiction as well. Non-fiction for children is children's literature, just as much as fiction. And I mentioned this because I am in contact with quite a number of people who've got a big names. I'm not going to name drop at the moment, but quite big names in children's literature, and who quite agreed with me. We need to have attractive books for children that actually focus on their interests, because that will make them want to read. And because they've got the language, the reading is easier. They don't have to work everything out from the letters. They've got their experience. If you see what I mean. And one of the things I do, I write down what children say. So when the people said to me, I want to be a marine biologist, I wrote down marine biologist. And we explained how the letters work there. And then I wrote down biology. And then we got the idea from that old BT advert that you get an ology, you're a scientist.
I remember it.
You know?
Yeah,
building up their understanding at all times. It's a conversation. And you do it with the class as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does make sense to me. So it's that love of reading. And I find something that I found that is working a little bit, though, not wanting to just be on the negative. What I found difficult is when you get students to read, and I think you're right, we do tend to go for fiction. I don't know whether that's because the sort of more creative sort of language you can use and the more sort of descriptive language you can use lends itself better within fiction. I don't know. Maybe you want to talk about that in a minute. But my feeling is, if I say to a group, if I say to my form, generally what schools will do is they'll dedicate a day to silent reading or something like that.
Whole day?
Sorry, not a day. I mean, so a session. Yeah, imagine.
I've seen it done. Believe me, I've seen
a quiet day. So a 20-minute slot, say during the form time or the registration.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I used to do that.
And I'll find, but what I'm finding increasingly in the students, I mean, first of all, they're not good with silence, which may be a separate issue entirely. But the second problem is they don't want to sit and read. But what I've found they do like to do is, if I read to them, as if they're maybe younger students, then most of them will like that a lot more. And then I will get them to read and take turns to read as well. And that's something that we've started doing more. And I have to say, that is working a lot better than, especially, the book we're reading at the moment is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime.
I don't know that one.
Which is interesting. It's written.
You see, curious, furious, serious, mysterious. You pick on a word and then you build up, and then instead of just having a word like curious, you're actually building a neural network with other words that have got the same thing. And every time they come, there's a tipping point in learning to read where you know enough to be able to use what you do know to work out a lot of what you don't.
And there's just been a comment there from Tom Rogers there, Rogers History. Interesting. They do like me reading to them. So it's something that
Tom, I agree. And I used to do a lot of that. And there's, can I just sorry, I'll elaborate on that very quickly and I'll shut up.
Sure.
What you can do with that, the reason is that if your experience of language is just every day, I often ask children if they listen to other people's conversations. Certainly not, but we all do it. The chance. Very few people are going to say more than 2 or 3, 4 words at a time. But when a skilled teacher like Tom is reading to them, first of all, he's lifting the text off the page. Secondly, he is instinctively adjusting his speed to the level at which the students understand. And there was actually some research on this at the United Kingdom Reading Association quite a long time ago, because that association's changed its name. But a researcher, and I apologize to them, I've forgotten their name, had compared the speed at which teachers read to their classes and the speed of published materials. At that time, there would be tapes of books that people would use. Not a bad idea. But of course, the actor has got, they're skilled people. They're going to speak clearly at a particular pace, but they don't know the class. They don't know where they've got to stop and point to something. They don't know the whole thing. The teacher is crucial. And I think, what Tom says there, my children, I did that because you're extending their understanding, their experience of language. You're reading, they're encountering sentence structures they're not going to meet in the playground. It's a very important thing to do. And then, of course, you said getting them to join in a bit. That's a good idea too. One has to be a little bit careful there, so that nobody's going to be put in an embarrassed position, but because that does damage, and I'm sure we would avoid that now. But in the past, I've had people say to me that they were hugely embarrassed and upset at having to read aloud in class. So if you know that, you've got to be careful. But that's just teachcraft, isn't it? It's
knowing your students.
It's knowing your pupils, absolutely.
Yeah, knowing your students, and actually, there's always more than enough in my form because they quite like to be sent. I mean, the other thing they like about this book is there's some swear words in it.
Oh yeah. Well, right.
So obviously that they're quite keen to get to that bit, and then they look at me to see what my reaction is going to be, and I'm like, well, it's in the book. It's in the book. You're saying it, and it's age appropriate. I would say, but yeah, they certainly enjoy the reading, and it's really interesting just watching them. Almost like on a good day, they're going back to, like I imagine primary school kids would be at story time when they're all sat. I remember being sat on the carpet, and I used to really look forward to sitting on the carpet in the corner of the classroom and listening to the teacher read a story. That was I remember that from my primary school days. But yeah, it certainly seems like, and obviously modeling that as well, because I don't know whether I felt like when my daughters were at primary school, that the schools were always very good at promoting and pushing for us to read with the children. They were always pushing that. I don't know whether that's something we do as much, whether we lose that. And you mentioned earlier the importance of the parent being part of the process, and I don't know whether we lose that a bit. I think, and there's a whole, I'd quite like to do a whole show on the issues going from primary into secondary, because there's
not a bad idea at all.
There's so many parents saying that, and there's studies been done on how happy students are as they go up. But it does make me wonder whether we're doing enough at secondary. Do you think there's anything? What do you think's going wrong between primary to secondary?
Oh, how long have you got? What do you think is going wrong where? In secondary or primary or where?
Well, obviously I'm being selfish as a secondary school teacher, but I am wondering, it seems to me, I mean, do you agree, first of all, that maybe we do reading better at primary and then students are kind of left to sink or swim in secondary a bit?
Well, certainly the second part of it is true. They are left to sink or swim far too often, and it's important that reading is built into the secondary curriculum. The first part of you said, I am concerned about the variation in the quality of reading that one sees in primary schools. The best work that I've seen is absolutely wonderful. A school in inner London where children were almost all had English as an additional language, and all reached the nationally expected level, which is a bit vague, but nevertheless they were deemed to have done that at 11, but not only reached it, but 2/3 of them were getting above it. Now that was remarkable, and it was what the school actually won an award as a result. They used our inspection evidence. I was delighted to work with that school, learned a lot. The word excellent, which seems to have been removed from Ofsted's vocabulary, most unfortunately, I was using just about like a machine gun. back in those times, we would be writing a paragraph. If we gave a top grade, we had a 7-point scale. If you gave a top grade, you had to write a paragraph saying how good it was. I was delighted to do that because we could all learn from it. And they had built reading. They would have, if it was an art thing, they would have a paragraph about, you know, how the art was done, or a history thing. They would be, the children would be reading it, and developing and making sure they understood it as a normal part of that lesson. And the result was astonishing. Fortunately, you know, occasionally people get medals and deserve them. And on that occasion, the head teacher had got an OBE, and I was delighted to say that the language coordinator, who was behind a lot of this, with brilliant, very, very good phonics in the early years to establish that the children could use the information contained in letters, followed by this extensive integration of reading into everything, and including non-fiction. This is a big, big mistake that the Plowden Committee made in 1965, or maybe the way that their work was interpreted. There is far too little good non-fiction in primary schools. So I'm concerned about that. And I'll also say that if you really want to develop oracy, which is an important thing in its own right, you must see the connection with literacy, because children will meet structures in books that they can use in their own spoken language. It feeds back into their own spoken language. And that school had a radio station, actually, which was a very good idea. And you know that when we were preparing this, you sent me some written notes, didn't you? Things we might talk about. The spoken and written language are intertwined. Absolutely. We need to understand. So I'm not saying, well, you know, I like to see good work wherever it is. Yeah. It makes it worth getting up in the morning.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I just want to say, we're talking about reading. If you want to do some reading, people watching this, then we'd recommend that you go and have a look at the John Catt website, where you can do a bit of reading and you can do some CPD on there as well. I'm just going to show it on the screen again, the code that you can use if you want to get on there. If you're working on your professional development, you want to read around something, it's a John Catt bookshop, and you can use the code JCTTR2425 and get 20% off. Okay, fab. Right, so John, we were just talking then about sort of primary and going into secondary. I mean, I've probably got to ask this question, really. Do you think there's an issue? Devices. We now have. We're in the tablet age, aren't we? I don't know what you'd call it. Maybe that's not what you'd call it. Do you think there is a little bit of an issue with the way that students and young people are, you know, getting this taking in information? Do you think maybe they're getting too used to receiving their information in a way other than the written word?
Well, this is a big issue, and the short answer is yes. The amount of screen time that children do, I mean, there's various research studies coming out on this. It is doing damage. One of the earliest items on this, on screen time, was a piece of work on my first book that had been done in Manchester. They thought there were a lot of reports from health visitors about what appeared to be an outbreak of deafness among the children. They weren't responding to the normal signs that they would use, such as making a sound behind them or something like that. And they thought they were deaf. When they investigated closely, they found out that the children were so used to watching television, spending all their time in front of a television and whizzes and bangs, they just didn't take any notice of them anymore. So what they did was, and it was a very good thing, it's a kind of thing that a lot of good nurseries do. They were finding ways of getting the parents to interact with their children and cut down on the screen time. Screen time is damaging because it doesn't require a response. It's all entertainment. And because it doesn't require a response, the effect on children's intellectual development can be very limited. Now, there are some things for which screens are fantastic. And the best one that I saw, the first one that I saw, was from the Open University. And it was in the early 70s. The Open University had just been founded. And they took a camera inside the Great Pyramid in Egypt. Now, I'm interested in history. And to be able to take a camera in there and get to places that one wouldn't have been able to get to see without going to Egypt, that was fantastic. And there are still things like that around. David Attenborough's wonderful programs. And a lot of the history, the huge expansion in history programs, practical reconstructions of the way things happened, and good explanations. I mean, at least one of the popular historians, whose name escapes me for the moment, he's got a blooming first in history from Cambridge. And he is able to take historical events with a very high professional level of understanding and present them clearly to people. And I just applaud. So it's a question of using. Yes, we can use it, and I do use it. I use a lot of audiovisual when I'm teaching French, for example, because that lets me present the spoken language with the same flexibility as I can a textbook. But as a general rule, I like the idea of not using phones in school, because phones can be used for all sorts of things that have got nothing to do with education, and there's no need to go into any detail on that. And I don't mean the most obvious one either, but I mean bullying. Yes, I don't like smartphones in school, and I quite agree with head teachers who have banned them. And particularly, having seen television programs of children sitting, having conversations with other children across the classroom, rather than listening to what the teacher's trying to tell them about maths and then complaining they haven't understood it. No, it's a serious problem. And I think most teachers agree now that it's a serious problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a competition for attention, isn't it? And certainly the negatives far outweigh the positives when it comes to students having their own devices. And it's a fight for the attention of them as well. I mean, I find I thought just occurred to me really. I mean, obviously when I grew up, it was. I mean, I do predate smartphones when I was at school, and obviously, reading is something in science. It requires you to have a creative mind, be able to think in an abstract way, and that's something that it's very difficult to sort of. It's not as easy skill to develop if you're always being presented with visual, something you can't interact with, and something that you don't need to think about.
I think that's very interesting. And I think it's very important that you just said that science is a creative activity. Science is as creative an activity, and in some circles, perhaps not the maths that I'm good at, but science is definitely as creative an activity as anything else. We live by it. I took my glasses off and I can barely see you. The science behind this and all the optics that have developed since the Renaissance. It's fantastic, and it's creative, and it should not be sort of put into some sort of box saying this is just STEM or something like that. Scientific thinking is as creative as well. I'm thinking of Professor Stein and his brother, the fish chef. You're creative if you're cooking. There's all sorts of ways of being creative.
Absolutely.
And it shouldn't be restricted.
Absolutely. And I think if you presented it on a very superficial level, I mean, like you say, videos are useful. If a student says to me, look, I don't know anything about this, I don't understand it, it will be like, well, go away, watch this little video clip, see how you feel about it, come back and speak to me.
Yes, so the come back and speak to me is the crucial bit.
And so it'll be okay. Exactly. So, and ask questions and reflect on it. But I sometimes do worry that children are losing that skill, because they're not expected. If I'm reading a book, I'm picturing that in my mind's eye. And that's something that I think is a magical thing that
Yes.
not all students are going to understand. If I read a really good, I don't read enough, if I'm honest. I don't read enough. And sometimes I'll try to read things that are a little bit above my ability. So I try and read.
Oh, I don't know about that. There's got to be
Brian,
too much about this.
I think I tried to read a physics book by a Brian Greene, who's quite a well-known physicist, and I could just about get it, but I had to keep rereading and rereading.
Well, that's fair enough.
But
I said that's absolutely fair enough. I mean, I know you're a science teacher. I don't know if one is reading. I mean, I did French. I read a book, the whole of a book by a man called Marcel Proust called À la recherche du temps perdu, and that is a very, very difficult read. And I'm not ashamed of having to work at it. I'm not ashamed of saying that it was blooming tricky, because I tell you get through Proust, your French grammar is pretty good.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
And it isn't when you started, it will be by the end of it.
No, I don't think I could cope with that. But yeah, it's just something that really occurred to me. So we were going to talk. Well, I'm sort of jumping all over the place. We were going to mention reading ages earlier on.
Oh, reading ages, right? Okay.
Do you think they're a useful thing? Do you think that they're an accurate tool that can actually be something that teachers can use to inform their planning?
Up to a point. What a reading age, the way you establish a reading age is that you take a test, you design a test, like the Neal analysis of reading ability, the Salford reading scale. Well, let's take the Salford reading scale. It's a very simple test. And that's one I used a long time ago. You give it to a sample of children in Salford. You then see at what point in the test 50% of the children have made a certain number of mistakes. From memory, it was about 6. And after they made 6 mistakes, you stop. And the point at which 50% of the population just got that far and no further, that is that reading age.
Oh, okay.
That's the way you do it. You analyze the responses to a test. And if 50% respond at a certain level, that is the reading age that is considered to be that level. Now, here, as a scientist, you will probably see a number of immediate problems. First of all, is the sample representative. Is what these children in Salford could read in 1966 represent any longer? First of all, was it representative then? Second, is it still representative? So when I have been called on for expert text, sorry, I use that word, but I mean, if you are consulted as a specialist in a legal case, you are technically an expert. I call on for expert opinion on this. And if you are reading, and there's a major test, which I won't mention now, but a major test that's used in assessments of people who had been dyslexic, assessed as dyslexic. And they sent out the test, their sample, to a very wide number, say 100 schools. And they had a low response rate. And they nevertheless based their standardization procedure on the schools that had responded. Now, here's the problem. Schools don't want to wash dirty linen in public, do they? So if your school would, well, I'm not sending that back. So they ended up with a set of results that was so skewed, they had to re-standardize the test, which was a very expensive thing to do. So I would give reading tests some qualified value. I don't use them now anymore. But when I did use them, what they told me was what a child couldn't do. That, you know, if somebody says a cat can run and a child can't read it, they've got a problem. And that tells me that, you know, we've got to start at a very basic level. But I have also, as an inspector, had a child read a test to me that the school was using. And I don't know, you had this particular child would read extremely fluently. I thought this was brilliant. So I asked him what one of the sentences meant. He hadn't a clue. But what he had done was sort of mastered. He was good at getting the sounds and matching the sounds of the letters, didn't understand it. So I think that they can be a useful tool. They can also be misleading. What you've got to think, what is it this child can read? And if I were in your position, I'd be thinking, what reading is going to help them with this subject? And then designing materials and giving them that. And it's the simple things that you can do. And then thinking, do they understand this? If so, great. What do we do next? If not, what do we need to do so they can understand it? So they are a limited tool. I would now only use one if somebody asked me to, for a particular reason. Say, you know, oh, we've had this test score. They've usually got 3 or 4 forms of the same test. I might, if I were asked to do it, I might say, okay, let's see how we get on with this one, just to check that, that it had been properly done. You need to be timing. There's so many things that can go wrong with one of these reading tests. They can be gamed. You can, if you want to get yourself a dyslexic assessment, you just don't try too hard. And some of the psychological tests, like remembering groups of digits, which is not the way we operate when we read, but they can be gamed. Oh, we don't want you to cheat, but
Yeah.
And so you get some private schools. A private school near me that's got 50% of its pupils assessed as dyslexic, and quite frankly, it's absolute rubbish. Because if they were genuinely dyslexic, they'd never have got into the place. It's so selective. So you get people who are gaming the system. And those are reading tests. I would look as if I were a head of department, a head of history or something like that, I could just about manage that because I really love history. I'd be looking, does the child understand this little passage? If I write, do they understand what we've been talking about if I present it in writing? Presenting the same things in spoken language and writing can be very helpful. One reinforces the other. So reading tests in themselves, they can be useful, but they need to be handled with great care.
I see. Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, in my experience as well, it depends on the effort that student is making. It could be that some students add enough and they're doing the test at the end of the day and they're tired.
All sorts of variations. Or you could be saying, oh, I had this child, he couldn't read, and look what he's just done. I've been there. I said, well, I've not done that, but I have seen it done. So yes, to be used with caution.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we are getting towards the hour, believe it or not. It's gone really quick.
Time flies when you're in good company, as somebody once said.
That's very kind of you to say. And I feel the same way, I have to say. It's really flown by. We did say that on the guest card, we were going to mention maths, and we might even get as far as the big O.
The big O. Well, quick thing on maths then. Quick thing on maths, because I started working on maths at request of parents because children were struggling with SATs. Again, we're looking for neural networks. We're looking for things to be understood. And sometimes people get overloaded. And I'll just mention multiplication tables because I've done a lot of work on them. I have had the 12-year-old child I was working with who wanted to be a marine biologist assured me that 3 2s were 8. Because he counted in multiples, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And he was trying to keep count with his fingers. So, all right, we stopped. Instead of going through the whole table, I said, let's just do the first 3. 1, 2 is 2, 2 2s are 4, 3 2s are 6. What are 2 2s? What are 3 2s? Right. And then went up to 10. So normally what I would do, I would just do half a table at a time to start with. It was, if you hadn't told me that 3 2s are 8, I would probably have gone up to 5 2s. But and then I make sure the 2 times table is rock solid before I do anything else, and with lots of praise for getting things right. But praise is a smart bomb. You use it to reinforce what's right, not what's wrong. So we did that, and then at the second half, getting children whose tables are not rock solid to go beyond the 2s and until they are solid is setting up problems. It's kicking the can down the road. So I make sure that everything, my basic principle with maths is the same as with reading. Make it crystal and then practice. And that don't mean crystal to me, I mean crystal to the child. Because once what you've got to do with all of this teaching, for when learning is not straightforward, you are setting up getting success. It's something they're worried about, and once they've experienced success, that lets you praise them. The positive cycle in education: you work hard, you succeed, you get praise. You work hard, you succeed, you get praise. You fail, you're unhappy, you get told off, you're not trying hard enough, you're doing this, you're doing that. So it's actually setting up so that each child can succeed. That's the key thing. That's what I do in maths. Again, we can talk about that in more detail perhaps some other time. And literally the big O. Well, the school that won the London Evening Standard School of the Year award back in the day and used our inspection report as its evidence and got the award from the award from the Secretary of State. I was actually very, very proud of what we'd done with that school, because we had a team of, I had a head teacher, 2 head teachers, a deputy. I had a team of 7 or 8, I think 7 inspectors, and we were in there for 4 solid days. We saw nearly all of the school's work. We had time to get beneath the surface and investigate its success. And we used a 7-point scale, not a 4-point scale. And that excellence that was actually cutting edge of primary education in London at the time, and still is, because that head teacher is still in place. The language coordinators become the head teacher. That is what inspection should be doing. And unfortunately, in 2005, the team I had, that team was just abolished. No more detailed lesson observations, no more paragraphs on excellent teaching in the report. The word excellent was out. And the reason it was out was that outstanding let them stretch it so that the very good and the excellent were combined. So the very tip of excellence that we can learn from was taken out. And that is still the case. When I inspected a secondary school, I led the inspection of a secondary school, I would have a specialist in each subject. I would have one myself as well. I would often lead on modern languages or English or history or special needs, because these are the areas that I worked in. You could nominate up to 3. We weren't a one-trick pony, but we had, and a teacher could be confident that an inspector who came into their classroom at least had some understanding of their subject. And that has gone. And Ofsted has become an instrument of government policy. And as far as I'm concerned, and was from the beginning, I've been saying this since 2006, in the Times Educational Supplement I was writing in that stage, become a tyranny. It has become a means of trying to see whether you're doing things the way it wants them done, rather than evaluating what you are doing. And I think that is a very, very backward step. And one of the reasons, and I'm not asking anybody to commit themselves to this, but I think very, very, very few people who are not actually on Ofsted's payroll have any confidence in it at all. And I certainly don't. There are good people, but you may know that a lot of Ofsted's inspectors, the inspector for maths, inspector for English, inspector for languages, inspector for RE, because they've stopped reporting on their work, they've stopped evaluating the national curriculum, they've left. And I think it's just a bunch of apparatchiks. I have got really serious concerns about the fairness of inspection and the damage it's doing to our profession. So I'm sorry about that. I've said it before. I actually And I've said it to the inspectors themselves, the chief inspectors. I know them. And since 2005, we have not actually had somebody who had professional inspection experience in any significant way. I think David Bell was qualified as an inspector. I don't know how much inspection work he did, and is appointed as chief inspector. They've had their skills in other areas. They've been successful head. Sir Michael Walsh was a very successful head teacher, very important work. And the thing is, I've said this to him myself, because I know him. I worked in Mossbourne School with the Modern Languages Department. I admire it. Some of the best German teaching the best German teaching I've ever seen, I saw in that school. That's his watch, and he gets the credit for it. But he said himself, he told the Common Select Committee he had no preparation to be chief inspector. And, the last chief inspector is basically an accountant, an MBA kind of person. Very little educational experience. So why should someone like that be telling someone like you what to do? They don't know themselves. So I'm very concerned about Ofsted at the moment. And Ofsted know it. And I will continue to make the case that teachers deserve to be inspected by people who really understand their work. And that's what Her Majesty's inspectors used to do and used to supervise other people doing, and what we've lost. And I think we badly need it back again.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So it is. I'm pretty sure there'd be plenty of people who would agree with what you're saying there, John. It does always seem to me, what concerns me when I think about Ofsted is they come in for 2 days, and I can't help feeling that when I think about my school at the moment, if they came in on one day, on a particular day of the week, and then they come in the following term, we could have two completely different outcomes from those 2 days. I also find that some schools might be good at hiding the things that they don't want the inspectors to see. And I think some schools are going to be better at that because they've got more capacity in order to do so. Whereas certain schools, you can't hide them. Not that you'd, in an ideal world, want to, because it goes obviously completely against the point of the inspection anyway.
Well, exactly. We don't live in an ideal world, do we? I organised the Memorial Fund for the head teacher who committed suicide following an Ofsted inspection. And it was one of the saddest things. And the reason I had to organise it was that the school leader who wanted to do it felt that they would be victimised if they did it. So I had to do it. I had to do it, otherwise it couldn't have got done. And the problem with that school, Caversham School, was that they wrote a negative report on a good school because of faults in paperwork or something. And you should not write, an inspector who wrote a negative report on a good school, frankly, can't really look themselves in the mirror and look people in the eye. And that's what's been lost. I sympathize with anybody who's inspected. If you're only in a school for 2 days, you don't get time. You see an incident, maybe. Is this part of a pattern, or is it just an incident because these things happen? You don't get underneath the surface. They have not, and even good inspectors, and some inspectors still are very good, they haven't got time to get beyond what they see and to triangulate evidence and build up a balanced and fair picture. And that's what's unfair. They are not given time to do the job properly. They haven't been for 20 years. And until they are, they will continue to spread stress, anxiety, and misery throughout the teaching profession. And it must stop. Somehow or other, we deserve better. Good teachers deserve better. I used to tell a school when I went in, for the parents, I'd say, well, look, you've got the most important investment in this school of anybody because you've got your children's future invested in it. So we're here to try and protect that. And to the staff, I would say, we're interested in what you do. We're looking to see the strengths in what you do, as well as anything that we think could be improved. And at the end of the day, I've got to be able to look you in the eye and myself in the mirror. If we do that, we'll get a fair result. And you can't do it now because you haven't got time to get the proper evidence. You do not inspect a lesson by walking through it for 10 minutes. It is ignorant to suggest otherwise. And I don't think school inspection should be based on ignorance. And if that means that I'm over concerned about this, frankly, we've had a conversation as one teacher to another during this program, and as before, and that's what should happen. The person who is doing the inspection should understand the work well enough to recognize where it's excellence. And I happen to think that if you're going to recognize excellence, you've got to be capable of it yourself. So you need good teachers as inspectors and not just managers.
Absolutely.
And Ofsted needs to rediscover its proper purpose. And I don't see any sign of it because politicians have got their hands on it and they cannot resist a lever of power.
And it's a problem as old as time, isn't it? With education as a political football. I can't really see anything changing hugely in the near future. If I'm totally honest, I don't want to be a total doom monger about it, but it is. Yeah, we're certainly heading.
Well, let's not end on that note. Let's end with the fact that you can take a child who can't read, and if you teach them in a way that they can understand, and you give them material that they're interested in, and you actually double track it. You're teaching them the phonics and the structures. You're also enlivening their interest, because one of the nicest compliments I've ever had, I had from the little boy that I was working from this. He said, after he'd read a whole page of it without any mistakes, "Now I understand why people enjoy reading."
Oh, well, that's what it's all about, John. That's what it's all about. And I think that's a good way to end it. I just want to say thank you so much to John for giving up his time this afternoon, coming on and sharing your experience. Excellent to hear from you. And for, I feel like I've learned an awful lot from you this evening. It's been a pleasure talking. Righty ho, everyone. Thanks to everyone who's tuned in and listened along while John and I have been talking shop, as we love to do as teachers. Hope everyone had a lovely day and has a very relaxing evening out there in teacher land. I'm sure you've all learned it very much. Thank you so much for joining us, guys, and I will see you in 2 weeks here on the Twilight Show. Goodbye,
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.